My name is Joshua Gibson, and you are listening to the Philosophical Weightlifting Podcast, a show dedicated to promoting a message of critical thinking as it pertains to strength training, nutrition, and well-being. This is done through interviews with experts, high-level athletes, coaches, and people heavily involved in strength sports and athletic development. Pull up a chair, grab a coffee, and let's get on to today's podcast. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Philosophical Weightlifting Podcast. I'm your host, Joshua Gibson, and I'm joined today by Dylan Suarez. And Dylan, I think that's the longest I've ever spoken to someone off air before we started recording. It was about 26 minutes. And I will say it was a really good potentiation conversation because I feel like this is going to be a hell of a podcast.
No, I agree. It's a good warm up, but yeah, we have kind of like you said, a lot of things in common, a lot of somewhat similar paths. So there's just a lot of things to talk about.
Yeah, when I think about, I kind of got into the whole like academia thing in a really weird, really strange way, and I honestly undertook it just because I wanted to do it. Like I told. I was seeing someone at the time, and I told her, it's like, hey, I want to get a PhD just because that's something I've wanted to do for 10 years. And I don't know what that's going to bring. I don't know what that means for a career or profession. I don't know what that really even entails. All I know is I want to do the thing. Mm-hmm. And now when I think about, okay, what does it mean for my career choices after the fact? Now it's like, oh, there's a reality of going into professional sports as a sports scientist or as someone involved with the performance side of things, or get into academia teaching. It's interesting thinking about potential opportunities to work for or intern with, say the UFC like you did, or to work with a big organization like the Reds like you did, and like Aaron has, and like, quite a few people who are kind of in our circle are currently doing or did. So you're one of the guys I've kind of looked at of like, oh, this guy has this body of work where he went to ETSU. He did a lot of really, really cool work, cool research, wrote a lot of cool papers. One I've referenced quite a bit. It's the paper on dynamic correspondence. The other one is phase-specific changes in rate of force development, muscle morphology, periodization and block periodization in sports, and the list really does go on. And those are all papers I wish I could write or would have written. And then of course, you get the internship with the UFC, you end up working with the Reds. It's like, man, this guy's kind of doing what I would really want to do. And I think that's cool because it sets this example of, hey, you can get into academia, for people who are maybe in weightlifting or in sport, and take it to the highest level, and then turn that into something that's, a professional position as a sports scientist, working with athletes on performance, and never having played the sport or been a fan of the sport, as you mentioned in our conversation, or have much experience with it. So you don't have to be a sport coach. You don't have to be a position coach. You don't have to necessarily know the techniques and the tactics of the sport. So I think it's really cool you've done that. And I'd love to have a really extensive conversation where you kind of talk us through why you made the choice that you did and why things kind of ended up working out the way they did.
Yeah, so it kind of started for me with weightlifting. So I found weightlifting pretty late. I started when I was about 20, got into it because I, like a lot of people, found out about CrossFit and started doing it a little bit and thought I really liked it, and then learned that I liked CrossFit because I liked doing like snatches and clean jerks and squats and stuff like that. And then the second I realized that that's a sport in of itself, and I don't have to do like running and pull-ups for time and stuff like that, I was like, oh, okay, I'm going to do that. So found weightlifting through CrossFit. At the time, I was going to school. I was studying exercise science, but I had absolutely no idea what I wanted to do with it. Um, I was working full time at a like martial arts and fitness center. I was still competing in martial arts. Actually, that was my original sport through like my teenage years and as a young adult. And then I was starting to dabble into trying to become a competitive weightlifter. Um, and I was doing all of those things okay. Um, and eventually got to a point that I wanted to go all in on school and weightlifting. So just like popped into Google university like weightlifting programs. And my assumption was that there was just going to be some like club teams and stuff here and there. And I was surprised to actually see that there was a couple universities offering, scholarships of some sort. ETSU being one, LSUS, Northern Michigan at the time. Sent emails to all of them. First one to get back to me was actually Meg Stone from ETSU. This was the summer actually before the next school year started. Um, and their weightlifting program there was somewhat relatively new, the scholarship program. So they're pretty actively looking for like new weightlifters. So that's why she got back to me real quick and was like, hey, if you could come up next weekend, do a tryout, um, you know, and do that, we'd see if you could potentially join the team. So I was living in Florida at the time. That's where I grew up, was living with my parents still. Um, Decided to do that, told my dad about it. He was like, let's do it. Drove up to Tennessee, tried out, made the team, got offered a small scholarship initially because I was very new to weightlifting. So they could see that I had some potential athletic skill that could translate over if they could help get me bigger and stronger, which is what ETSU is good at. So um, ended up like it was really like within a month or two, like this all happened. Quit my job, transferred universities, went to Tennessee, like went all in on weightlifting. That's where I started to learn what sports science was. Before that, I purely went there as a weightlifter. Like I didn't know, I wasn't really familiar with who the Stones were or the program they had. I just kind of went blindly as a guy that was into weightlifting. Um, just luckily ended up in this program that is well known for sports science and strength training. Um, um, Got to learn about sports science, found it really interesting. Um, as soon as I found out that I could get a doctoral degree in sport, I was like, that sounds awesome. I'm going to do that. And kind of similar to like you said, didn't really know exactly what it entailed or what I would do with it, but I was at a place that I got to like lift and study, and that's it. And I was cool with that, and I was cool with doing that for many more years. So basically, just did that. I continued lifting, finished my undergrad, did my master's, continued as an athlete on the weightlifting team. While I was doing my master's, when I started actively getting into research and putting out publications, and then was actively involved in the sports science side with our weightlifting team as I was still an athlete on the team. Um, Finished up the master's, decided to do the PhD. Um, when I decided to do the PhD, I decided to basically retire, stop lifting, and then shift towards my interests. We're a lot more interested in coaching and the research side of things. So um, I stopped lifting competitively myself, moved into a coaching role with the team at ETSU as an assistant coach and like the lead sports scientist for the team, and then continued my studies into the PhD. That's kind of how it like got me into like this route in the first place, which is really interesting because, like I said, at the time I had no idea of like what I was really getting myself into. I was just somebody that got like interested in weightlifting, did some Google searches, found out about this university, and then ended up down the path that I did.
Yeah, and that, I mean, that's a great story because one, it resonates with me, but I'm sure it's going to resonate with a lot of people. And I think what makes a difference in what we really need. in this like industry, I don't want to say industry, but like space would be people that, athletes, coaches, enthusiasts, students can look up to as a way of like, oh, that's a possibility. I can do that. Not I can do that, but like that's what I want to do, and that's what I'm going to do. And it's like, oh, here's this kind of like relatively straightforward path. And I can go to this university and I can get in this program, and I know people, and I know places, and I know um, specialties, and I know now that there's a process by which it can happen. Instead of, I was kind of in the same boat. I was thinking about kind of a lack of sports science in the U.S., and I remember reading a lot of Doc Stone stuff, and really it just felt like ETSU was kind of the only place. And obviously there are other programs and other sports science departments, but it really feels like ETSU is like the place to go if you want to become an expert level sports scientist, and that can work in multiple settings and multiple sports and be like a critical piece of that. And that's honestly when I saw that Dr. Hornsby was at WVU, I was like, oh, well, I'll kind of go and be a part of making that program something, or growing it potentially, or just being there while it's growing. So I think it's great that we have, myself and yourself. And I think Aaron's a good example, but a few people who, listeners of the podcast can look to is not inspiration, but kind of like counterfactual idea of like, oh, in a different life, that's what I could do. Maybe I should make that a reality. One thing I would be interested in hearing, because looking at your Google Scholar and just your publications, you've done quite a bit of work. Was that something you planned on, or was that something that was just suggested or expected when you were getting your doctorate?
Hey, what's up, weightlifters? Danny here, founder of Onyx Weightlifting Co., a leather accessories company specializing in weightlifting gear. In our shop, we make gear that doesn't get in the way of your performance, because we understand that hitting lifts requires your full attention. Our straps, wrist wraps, and belts are designed to be comfortable and reliable, so all you need to do is make lifts. Thanks for listening to our friend Josh's podcast. You can continue to support him by visiting our online shop at onyxstraps.com and using his code PHILWL. That's PHILWL at checkout. See you on the platform.
When I first started the doctorate, I did want to stay in academia. I was really interested in the like research side of things. I initially, like in undergrad and then even early in my master's, was considering going more the strength and conditioning route. Did internship just like within the athletic department at ETSU as a strength coach, and kind of through that and through my master's degree realized that like my personality, my skill set, my interest, like make me much better of more of like a researcher, science, like analytical side of things than a coach. So I kind of shifted that route. And then when I did that and I was like looking ahead, I had, a PhD, which was going to take me at least 3 years to do. And then I was looking at like the potential job opportunities, the most like reasonable, like best job for somebody interested in that area was being a professor and doing research. Like that just seemed like the best and only route. And then as I'm doing the PhD, like more and more of these like applied sports science jobs started popping up, and they had been around for a while, but they're really more here and there with various different sports teams. But really, I saw them just like actively popping up, like on job boards, like baseball teams, basketball teams, like the UFC, like all these different major sporting organizations hiring sports scientists, and that started to look like more and more interesting. And then I had colleagues such as Aaron Cunanan, who I had been around and studied with while we were at ETSU. He was doing his PhD while I was doing my master's, as well as a few other of those PhD students within his same cohort graduated, and they all went into like these type of more applied roles instead of the professor route. So once I saw them do it, it looked kind of a lot more realistic, like you said, and it just started to look a lot more interesting. So originally, yeah, like back to your original question, I got involved in the research because I wanted to be a professor, and professors do research. And then that kind of like throughout the PhD turned into more. I'm going to do research to understand basically athlete monitoring practices and how to make them more realistic and practical, because I knew that that's what I was going to end up doing if I got one of these more applied routes. So I kind of shifted from more of a doing more formal research. My original dissertation, I was leaning more towards doing more of a traditional training study type, and then shifted completely more to like a more athlete monitoring type research, like looking at best ways to monitor athletes, best ways to make it practical and applicable. Uh, yeah, like I said, initially started because I wanted to get those publications on the resume in order to be, a successful academic eventually, and then eventually shifted more towards doing it to get better at these applied sports science processes for the jobs that I was transitioning into. And then if I was doing them anyway, might as well try and publish them so you could put them on the resume. So yeah, that's kind of how it ended up starting, getting involved in that research process, and then continuing with it up until I wrapped up my PhD just a year or two ago.
Originally, I got into this program and I thought, well, I'm thinking now I'll get into academia and be a professor. Probably less on the research side, more on the lecturing side. And my GA position is actually at a local high school, and I'm the strength coach. And I love weightlifting. I love strength training. I love getting people strong. Strength and conditioning is not something I would ever do as a career, likely. No, it's something I would never do as a career. I might do it professionally as a way to I'd love to be on the strength staff with the Buffalo Bills. Like, okay, I'll do that for however long. But similar to you, I don't like my personality. I think like my overarching like way of being, I guess, has changed because what you have to do when you're a strength and conditioning coach, the role you have to take on, the way you have to kind of command a presence and carry yourself. It's definitely changed me, but I think it's something I probably wouldn't do long term. So thinking about this internship with the UFC that we spoke about extensively, it's like, okay, maybe I not try my hand, but like experience the sports science role and the sports science side of things, and then experience what that could be or could do. So it almost, when you're talking about the way your career has developed, it's interesting hearing about that and thinking about like how I'm anticipating mine develops, because I think my dissertation is going to be on the assessment and monitoring of strength and power characteristics in like high school athletes. So it's like a lot of monitoring stuff, which I guess would set me up to be helpful or to be prepared for the sports science role. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but that's just kind of like an interesting connection there.
Yeah, no, for sure. Yeah, I think it's nice because there's a lot more flexibility and like roles that are becoming available. If you still do want to stay in academia, there's more and more universities that are trying to establish like true sport performance programs and doing research related to sport and things like that. So like those options are only getting better. As far as like if you want to go the more applied route, like work for a professional sports team or collegiate, like there's more and more, like every day you see a new sports science role pop up. It's really rapidly growing in baseball specifically. Like it's gotten to the point that pretty much all baseball teams have at least one sports scientist or like sports scientist / biomechanist. And then now there's a lot that have full kind of established departments with multiple sports science staff. And I only see that like continuing to grow. That's just within baseball. I think as far as like the full sports science departments, at least within the States, baseball seems to be growing a little bit faster as far as like the size of the departments, where most of the other sports still seem to have like maybe one, maybe two sports scientists or like dual S&C sports science roles. Whereas in baseball, you're seeing a lot more common for there to be, a director and then a minor league coordinator and then multiple assistant type levels too. So it just gives you like way more options for somebody that's like within the U.S. that's interested in a career in studying the science of sport, way more than there was just a couple of years ago when I was doing my PhD, and then definitely exponentially more than there was like 10 years ago and longer than that. So it's definitely a positive outlook for like yourself or then anybody else that's like starting to get interested in this field.
Yeah, and I'd love to talk about that, which we will, but I don't. I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about the publications that you have authored and co-authored, because they're really, really cool, and really cool because they're directly related to what this podcast is about, which is like this thoughtful approach to strength, and by thoughtful I mean like critical, analytical, thorough. So maybe you could start. I don't really know how to approach it. I'm not just going to start naming papers and for you to give me like your thoughts on the results. But what are some of the studies that you have done or been a part of that have been impactful in your understanding of the training process or the way you've approached the training process?
Yeah. So, I mean, overall, most of my research was related in some way to either understanding periodization strategies, or finding ways to better monitor athletes that are undergoing different periodization strategies. In some way, they all kind of like fit into that, main hierarchy. The earliest one was my master's thesis. It was my first like study that I conducted, and it essentially, like I was talking about, just used athlete monitoring data that we were already gathering with our weightlifting team. We were regularly doing isometric and dipole testing with them just about every month, and then we were doing ultrasound testing to understand muscle size and muscle morphology of the vastus lateralis, the quad muscles. We were regularly doing that at a pretty like constant 3 to 5 week cadence. We were doing both those tests with a group of anywhere from 12 to 15 weightlifters. We were doing that over like multiple years. And so the initial study that I did was essentially just looking at those things and trying to understand and basically analyze ways to monitor changes that happen within different phases of the program. So if you're familiar with like, the basis of like block periodization, like it starts with some like larger, higher volume phase, like different terminology for it. You can call it strength endurance, accumulation, hypertrophy, like whatever the name of the phase is, some sort of higher volume phase, developing work capacity, developing hypertrophy, tissue growth. And then you have, your transmutation, your like middle strength power phases, and then more of like your peaking, tapering, speed type phases. So I basically wanted to use the monitoring tools that we had available to understand, one, if they could even effectively assess the different changes that happen in those phases. And then two, just look essentially at what happened. Because, we have there's the periodization theory, which is, you sequence things in this way and they each potentiate each other. You make a muscle bigger, you make that muscle stronger, you make that muscle more powerful, and sequencing in that manner is more effective than sequencing in a different manner, right? That's the theory. So I basically wanted to like objectively assess that, like what measures could we look at to see what's specifically happening, And then the practical application from that would be you can use that to actually assess the efficacy of your training. So if you have specific training phases, whether you use block periodization or you use whatever sort of periodization concept you do, most people have some sort of like emphasis to each training phase. And by applying effective athlete monitoring practices, you can see if you're actually having that, if that emphasis is actually occurring, like if your training is actually doing what it's supposed to. So to kind of quickly recap that initial study, what we did was we found in the initial like higher volume, strength endurance type phase with our weightlifters that their muscles got bigger. Their peak force and isometric mid-dipole didn't necessarily change a whole lot. There was some potential deficits in their rate of force development, so their ability to quickly apply force. But like I said, peak force didn't change. So the max amount of force they could produce, pretty stable, some potential decrement in their rate of force development, which can be a bit of a sketchy measure. So there's definitely some variability there, but that was kind of the trend that we would recognize. Moving into the strength power phase, more moderate volume, heavier, higher intensities. There was an initial like pretty big increase in hypertrophy after that initial high volume phase that came down slightly. Some of the theory for that is some of that initial growth that we saw could have been due to like some like muscle cell swelling from like the higher volume, and basically just holding on to more like liquid initially before it actually turned into like true contractile tissue. And then like that came down a little bit in that strength phase. And then finally, in the strength phase, we also saw, once again, not much of a change in the max peak force they produce, but saw a very large rebound in their rate of force development. So it kind of showed that like super compensation effect that's often touted of like higher volume overloading training, where we saw a bit of a potential decrement and then a large like super compensation in their ability to produce force fast. And then in the last peaking phase, we did see somewhat of a slight decrease in muscle size. You have to take into account that these athletes some of them were cutting to make weight for a weightlifting competition before this final testing session. So that caloric restriction could have influenced that a little bit. Overall, between the tests, I don't think their body weight had actually changed, but that's likely because they just got back up to their old body weight after having to cut. And a lot of that was probably because they ate really bad after a competition. And, a lot of that was probably more like hydration. But their muscle was slightly smaller after that peak tapering phase than it was in like after the strength power phase. And their rate of force development maintained. There was some potential that like the shorter, really early phases were the highest in that peaking phase, which would make sense, at least theoretically. And then the peak force also still didn't change much. So like one of the main findings was peak max force didn't seem to be very like sensitive to the training phase. It seemed to be pretty stable. And I think if you looked over like the whole big macro cycle, it increased in a good amount of the lifters. And then definitely over multiple cycles, we would see that. But it wasn't super sensitive. Like you weren't going to recognize if your training was effective within a short, like 2 to 4 week period by only looking at peak force. But the rate of force development did seem to be a little bit more sensitive, but it's also like highly variable. So it can be difficult to see, like to get some signal in the noisiness of it. But their basically overall finding was like there's some potential in looking at more rate of force development, high early force time phase type characteristics instead of just the peak within different phases. And then as far as like in the muscle morphology thing, we saw a little bit of those like phase specific changes, like big increase initially after the high volume, came down a little bit, and then came down a little bit more after the peak taper, but actually ended higher than it started. So if you think like over multiple macrocycles, let's say you have 3 macrocycles for a lifter per year. If each one of those from start to end, they get a little bit, their muscles get a little bit larger, like year to year to year. Like these were well-trained weightlifters. So you can imagine you are going to see, overall increase in like muscular development. It's just not necessarily going to happen like every single phase, which makes sense. Like you're not necessarily trying to get bigger quads while you're peaking to compete in a like lifting event. You know what I mean? So that was the findings of like that initial study, and really a lot of the studies I did were just basically finding like the best, most efficient ways to understand the training process is doing what it's supposed to. And that's what that initial study did with the population that I was working with.
Yeah. And you mentioned some of the changes in very specific markers, which would be like muscle morphology or muscle size, and then you would say the function of the muscle, and it's like absolute force production or peak force, and then like force time characteristics. Were those correlated to performance changes, but did you see performance changes across time too? Like, the weight, a certain number of the participants also hit competition PRs, or they hit, set rep PRs, or, did those improvements also correlate to improvements in performance, or were they somewhat unrelated?
Yeah, I mean, it was mixed like it is for any, singular competition. For that study, we only looked at like one training cycle. And it was in a pretty small sample. I think overall at the end, I had like 9 lifters through one full like macrocycle of training from start to end for peaking for a competition. So, some had set personal records, some didn't. It wasn't a large enough sample to like do any sort of correlations of like did the ones whose peak force increased the most increase their weightlifting total the most. And then even if the sample was bigger, it could get kind of difficult to do because if the athlete doesn't set a total, if they bomb out,
Right.
then you can't run any sort of correlation on it because what do you set their total as? Like you can't set it as like 0 and then sometimes they'll have a good competition. They went like 6 for 6 and they only set like a 1 kilo personal record.
Right.
But for some people, that's super significant if they've been training for a long time and we're competing for medal and things like that. So it's difficult to like quantify those things directly to like the weightlifting performance, especially like over one macrocycle. But I did transfer to like some of my later research during my PhD. We did do a much more like long-term look at this time specifically counter movement jump measures and the relationship between the change in an individual's jump measures and a change in their weightlifting performance. This is my PhD dissertation, so a lot longer to work on it than I did my master's thesis. So we were able to take, basically I took as much of our athlete monitoring data we had with weightlifters as we did. I mean, it was almost, at the longest, it was probably like 7 years worth of data.
Wow.
For athletes, anywhere from like a year to 5 years of consistent lifting and competing and doing jumps every like 3 to 6 months. So that was like a much larger sample, long-term, longitudinal type look. And we did identify some relationship between jump measures. The 2 we looked at were both jump height and then impulse from the counter movement jump. The strongest predictor within weightlifters was actually impulse. And there was like a within athlete relationship that as impulse increased or decreased, there was a shared relationship between that and an increase and decrease in their Sinclair total. So that we were able to identify some like performance relationship between these kind of non-specific general physical characteristics, these forced time measures we were getting, and their actual like performance on the platform.
And how does, I think what could potentially, okay, so I think this is why my role is relevant, and why what I do is perceived as being important, is because I try to read as much research as I can. I try to read as much theory as I can. I try to talk to as many coaches as I can, and then I think about translation of theory to practice, like translational issues. And I communicate with people like yourself and Chris Tabor and Dr. Hornsby and Doc Stone, all these people, and talk about training. We talk about training theory, practice, experience, talk to athletes, and create this cohesive, is like coherent a picture as possible, and say, what should the training process look like and why? And then any potential changes, like, okay, how do we integrate them? How do we make sense of them? You have now like a pretty, what I would call like a pretty strong, no pun intended, background in studying, the training of a weightlifter to some extent, or at least like the training process, or monitoring the training process specifically with weightlifters. If you were to imagine yourself as the club director of a weightlifting club, or someone who coaches a lot of weightlifters, how would all of your work inform practice, or how would you think differently about the training process as a weightlifting coach?
I think the biggest thing is just trying, like, whether it's weightlifting or any sport, like we talked about, bringing like true objectivity to what you're doing. So like everybody has, when they program, they have this larger purpose between each thing that they're doing. Like when you decide on a phase that you're utilizing, that you're putting before another phase, like there's some purpose behind that. Like you want some sort of potentiation of the first phase to the second phase. When you select a certain exercise, if you select an exercise over another exercise, you probably have a certain reason to do that. If it's a weightlifting derivative that you're selecting for an athlete, it's probably because you want to build some sort of specific strength in a certain position, or you want them to practice that position regularly in order to make some sort of mechanical change or improvement. So you have all these like larger goals and emphasis to your training program, and then you should have some way or some method of trying to determine if what you're initially programming, the initial purpose, is actually occurring. Now you're going to have a lot of variability in that type of stuff, because we're not dealing with like robots that like the only thing affecting them is our training program. Like there's a lot of other things that can influence that. But if you can find ways to regularly track that over time, it kind of becomes a feedback mechanism where, after so long of seeing the results and then doing a certain, change to your training program or a specific exercise, and then seeing those results again, over time, you like learn from that, and you just become like a more effective, coach in that way. We see that a lot in like baseball. Like we have a ton of technology that now, like every single pitch that our players, our pitchers throw is recorded by some sort of technology that's showing the velocity of the ball, the spin rate, the shape of it. And one of the things that has done for the coaches is it's made them much more, at least the ones that integrate the technology well, is it's made them much more effective coaches, because they constantly have that feedback. So when they see a pitch do something visually in their head, then they can go immediately validate that on the technology, the iPad. And if it's a little different than they observe, they get to kind of like recalibrate what they just saw, and they just become more effective, more accurate coaches. And I think it could be the same thing with weightlifting and strength and conditioning, like whatever monitoring you're using, if it's force plates or VBT or something like that, like you don't always have to be making changes because of it, but you should definitely be trying to like learn from it. Like if you did this and you expected this, and you didn't see that, try to understand why, and then just keep observing it over time. And I think that only makes, us more effective practitioners in like any sport, or any endeavor really.
No, that's a great answer. And it's something I think about a lot. And it's like keeping that thread of like criticality in your programming process of, we all have to some extent like access to the same information, but it's how do you use it? But it's not like it's not a buffet, and that like, oh, I just went to every place I wanted to go and I got all this stuff and it's on one plate. But it's more so like, order something. What did I like about it? What didn't I like? Okay, I have a menu. I have the training map. I have the menu. I have all the information. I want to order something else that's a little similar but different because I didn't like how sour or salty it was. You get the next plate. I really like these components, and then it's an iterative process over time until you're like, I've kind of found what I really enjoy and what really works. And we're going to make subtle changes. And we might even just make changes to the timing, not even the ingredients or the preparation. So that makes sense to me. And I think it resonates too with the process, which I don't, it's one of those things where you imagine, this is what a PhD is, and you think about it and you're like, oh, I know what it is. But then you're enrolled in the classes and you're like, oh, it's training you to think quite a bit more than you would have imagined. And it's challenging your thinking, and it's expanding the ways you think and introducing new patterns of thinking, processes. And you're like, oh, so that's like a critical component. It's a huge component. It's just the process of thinking differently about stuff, which is kind of what you introduced. So I think that's great.
Yeah, I would agree with that 100%. Like initially what you're talking about like the subtle changes and the iterative, and like the menu example you did is a good one, because talking about like athlete monitoring related stuff and how it can be involved in the training process, one temptation a lot of people will have is when they start doing monitoring is to like always be making changes on it. And then the one issue that runs into is when you start changing anything, it's, going back to science, you also often in traditional like experiments have some sort of control group, right?
Right.
If you start changing everything, then you have like no control to like compare to. So like you don't know if like the changes that you're seeing are because of the changes you made or the changes you made before that, or because of the initial like training structure. So yeah, they have to be like pretty subtle and they have to be informed, and you just have to like learn from them over time, which I thought was a great point. And then to your point about the PhD, yeah, it's more than anything, it's like basically it's giving you time to like get better at learning, and develop that. Because I realistically, like my PhD specifically is in sport physiology, and a lot of the deep physiology that I learned, I've forgotten a large majority of it. Like I can't remember all of the details of the Krebs cycle and glycolysis and everything like that. But the one thing that I for sure got out of the PhD is I got like way more effective at like finding information and learning things. So like I know if for whatever reason that I need to like remember this like specific physiological mechanism again, that I can go quickly and find where I need to review it, and then it's going to be like quickly right there. Or if there's something that comes up that I need to understand that is just completely out of like the scope of my expertise, I have these like new skill sets that I've developed through studying something like hyper specific that kind of like generalize, and then I can go out and like read and learn more broadly because I spent years trying to study this like very specific, like hyper detailed thing about how to make weightlifters more muscular and more powerful. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think that's great. In an attempt to not just get sucked down too many different rabbit holes, I honestly would love to talk a bit about your internship with the UFC. One, because I don't watch it now. I keep up with it very subtly, but I would stream it like every weekend. I'd watch it all the time. I was always looking at fights, and I think it's really interesting. I think mixed martial arts is really fascinating because it's the introduction of so many different skills, and it's not that they're disparate or like very, very different, but they are very different. I mean, like a ground game versus stand-up game versus, say wrestling and some different type of grappling versus some type of judo versus like you have all these different, very different skill sets that you kind of compile into a person. And then you express that in, the constraints of the fight in an octagon with certain round lengths and then certain do's and don'ts. And then you think about like, okay, all that stuff's overlaid on top of physiology, which is the process of utilizing energy to create movement, motion, and action. And then that creates byproducts and then all this, like you have to fuel and you have to dispose of, and you have to do a bunch of other things to keep these people fighting and fighting well and fighting for, long rounds. So I think just because of that, like mixed martial arts is super, super fascinating. And I'd love to be involved with it. You talked to me earlier before the podcast about how you kind of like the process of your PhD and then how you got into the internship and then how you ended up getting into baseball. And we didn't really explore the baseball stuff as much, which I would love to do during the podcast. But maybe you can just kind of recount how the internship with the UFC came about, what your experience was like, and then kind of like from a fan perspective, what it was like working with, some of the best fighters in the world.
Yeah. So the UFC was a pretty awesome experience for me because I did grow up a big UFC fan. I mean, I was watching like recorded UFC tapes that my dad had of like UFC 1, 2, and 3, like Hoist Gracie and stuff. Like I was like a kid, so was always a fan. And the UFC Performance Institute was actually like established and created right around the time that I was starting and doing my master's degree in sports science. So it was like this like interesting clash of worlds. Like I got involved in this world of sports science, and then I had already always been a long-term like fight fan, and then this thing, the Performance Institute, came about that is both of them involved. And ever since I saw that it was going to be a thing, I was like, I gotta somehow get my foot in the door there one day just to see what it's like. So that was years ago when I was doing my master's, and then when I was doing my PhD, the way the coursework worked at ETSU was the first 2 years are actual like coursework where you're in a classroom learning and doing things like that. And then the last year, there's some courses, they're mainly online and they're less non-traditional classes. You're not regularly like going into a classroom regularly. It's mainly more dedicated for you to work on your research and your dissertation. And what happened was I started my PhD in the fall of 2019. So my very second semester of my PhD, the pandemic hit, of course. And so the whole second semester and a lot of the summer of my PhD was spent at home with not a lot to do, which actually conveniently allowed me a lot of time to kind of get ahead on my research and my dissertation. So kind of coming out of that first year of my PhD and then definitely into the second year, I was well ahead of my research. Like most of the data had been analyzed. I had my results. I had started writing some of the papers. I was pretty far ahead before my third year even started. And then my third year was literally just going to be dedicated to doing the research. There wasn't actually regular classes. So I kind of decided like it's probably a good time to try and like get some more like broad experience and do something a little different. And it was kind of a perfect time to try and get my foot into the door of UFC. So what I did was I applied for an internship as a sports science intern at the UFC during the summer before my last year of my PhD. Ended up getting that role, ended up staying there for the summer and the fall. So I ended up spending 6 whole months there interning. It was convenient timing because I was still kind of like writing my dissertation. I was still a PhD student technically, so it wasn't quite ready to like start applying for like real jobs. But it was like a good transition phase where I got to start to get this more applied experience in a professional organization while finishing up my PhD. And then it was also extremely different from my previous experiences because I'd spent all this time coaching, working with, researching, and understanding weightlifters, with like a large bias to like the strength power side of things, and then go to these very, like you said, mixed modality type athletes that have to be strong and powerful, but they also have to be extremely fit, extremely durable. So while I was there, I got to do a lot more work on like the metabolic side, doing a lot of things like VO2 maxes and stuff like that, which was a nice kind of balance to my largely focused strength power research previously. And then also just got to be around this company and this organization, these athletes that I had been always fascinated with as a fan. And overall, it was a really good experience, like really helped kind of like balance my abilities as a sports scientist. Got to be involved in an organization that I've followed for years. So really positive experience overall. Towards the tail end of that is when I started to kind of look at like long-term like career pathways and get interested in sports like baseball and stuff like that. I kind of started to realize, kind of like you hinted, that while working at the UFC was really awesome and kind of like a dream, I realized that I didn't necessarily need to be like a huge fan of the sport I was working with to like do that job well. Because I found being a sports scientist for other sports that I maybe not had followed for as long as the UFC still just as interesting, just because they all have that competitive aspect. Like you go there, the main purpose is to increase performance and essentially try and win. So like whatever the sport is, whether it's fighting or weightlifting or baseball or whatever, that aspect is there. So I was going to be interested in it. So that's what kind of like led me more towards the baseball pathway, because it basically had a lot more career opportunities. Because at the UFC, there was the singular Performance Institute, which at the time only had one director of sports science, one full-time role, and then an intern. Whereas in the baseball world, there's 30 baseball teams. They all had at least like one sports science role. A lot of them had multiple. So like as far as like career pathways, growth, and then like influence that a sports scientist could have, all of those things kind of led me into being much more interested in going down the baseball route.
Yeah, and that's a great recap, and I'm interested to hear about your time with the Reds. But before we kind of jump into that transition into baseball, one thought I was having, because when we talked off air, you mentioned how you drove from Johnson City, Tennessee to Vegas, and you did the internship, and then you drove back, and then you were in town for like 4 or 5 days, and then you pretty much like drove across the country again. And it sounds like you've had a lot of really big life changes. I mean, considering, getting your PhD, doing that, interning with the UFC Performance Institute, and then getting a job with the Reds, getting a job with the Giants. I mean, these are like, those are aspects of someone's, professional career that you hear and you think, wow, that's so awesome and so incredible to be involved with such a big, prestigious organization. But what you don't see would be like that commitment, right? That leap of faith, that decision to pursue the next thing, or to pursue the perceived better thing. How'd you manage all of those big life changes or potential life changes, where it isn't really as simple as saying, hey, I want to do this thing. We have human physiology, and that often involves, stress hormones and perception and trying to make sense of all of it and to not let it be overbearing. So how did you manage all the processes of deciding what you wanted to do, deciding if that was for you, pursuing opportunities in alignment with that, and then going to the next thing and the next thing?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it, to be honest, a lot of it's a bit of luck. Like I can't deny that. I mean, from the initial big move that got this all started was deciding to move from Florida to Tennessee and quit my job and like pursue weightlifting full time. Like that was the initial like kind of like big one that like kicked it all off. And then yeah, in more recent years, um, they were all like big, somewhat difficult decisions, but all calculated, and they all kind of like made sense. Like it started. COVID was an incredibly disastrous, inconvenient thing, but the one convenience that I did have out of it was I was stuck at home and I ended up spending a lot of time on the computer, which allowed me to get way ahead of my dissertation.
Mm.
Doing that gave me this kind of extra time and space where I wouldn't normally have doing a PhD, to kind of go out and get additional experiences before even finishing that. So that timing and that the way that worked out made going to Vegas to do an internship a lot easier, because otherwise going and being an intern while you're a PhD student is actually kind of like weird. Like when I went to UFC, there's a whole cohort of interns, like not just Performance Institute. There's business interns, law interns, and they're all like 21, 22-year-old like undergrads doing internships before they get real jobs. And then I'm like in my upper 20s, about to get a doctoral degree, and then I'm doing an internship at like the same place they are. So like to them, it's kind of like, wait, you're doing a PhD, you could potentially go be a professor within the next year, but you're an intern right now. But so when you look at it that way, it was weird. But to me, it was like I have this year anyway where I don't have to be specifically in a classroom, and I have this summer open where all I need to do is work on a research project on my computer. Like, why not go and work in this organization that I've found fascinating for my whole life? So like it was a hard but easy decision to go and do that. The harder one was when I did the initial 3-month internship, and they asked me to stay for another 3 months to do the fall internship. That was a little bit difficult because I kind of had to continue to push my dissertation back a little bit, and then I spent another 3 months on the opposite side of the country when my wife was still in Tennessee because she was in nursing school at the time. So I ended up overall having to spend like 6 months without her, which was a difficult decision, but it just like career wise made a lot of sense. And then, like I said, a lot of luck involved. And coming towards the tail end of that internship, somebody that I'm working with there at the UFC, Aaron Cunanan, gets this opportunity in baseball at a time that I had specifically been looking for jobs in baseball. And the timing worked out almost perfectly. I had to drive my car all the way to Tennessee before actually finding out I got the job, and then driving back all the way to Arizona would have been a little bit more convenient if I heard just before. But I mean, other than that, like the timing couldn't have worked out much better. I specifically remember being at the UFC, and like I was looking at a bunch of other baseball jobs, and I was looking at more like intern, fellow, associate type jobs just to get my foot in the door. And I remember like walking into Aaron's office, and I was about to ask him about this like baseball role. And it was essentially like an intern role. It was like a sports science associate or something like that. And I was going to ask him what he thought about that. And he was like, hold off on that for, like a week or so. I might have something a lot more interesting. And then, a few weeks later he did, we both ended up, going on to work with the Reds. So yeah, like I said, they're all somewhat difficult decisions, very calculated, and then also just like a lot of luck involved. Like I talk a lot about that stuff, and when I think about it, it seems like it's been over like multiple years, but it's really only been within like all of that stuff has happened within like the past 2.5 years. Like
Wow.
UFC, Cincinnati Reds, PhD, San Francisco Giants. Like it's all been like very recent. And it's been a lot of luck and convenient timing, and obviously like hard work and difficult decisions. But it definitely could have been a lot more harder than it did, just due to some luck on my end.
Well, and I've made some really big decisions like that. And when I moved in 2022 to go work with Max Ada in Oakland, California, and I was living in Columbus, Ohio, and just the way things worked out, I was at like I was coaching at USA Powerlifting Nationals, and Max was also there, and we ended up getting coffee. He talked about needing someone to kind of run his gym. I was like, hey, let me get back to Columbus and I'll give you a call. And, 2 weeks later or a few weeks later, I drove my car from Columbus to Oakland and then slept on his couch for 2 months, got a place in Berkeley, and then kind of worked with him and collaborated. And we did that for like almost a year. And then kind of during that time, I got inspired and kind of prodded a bit to take the GRE and to apply to a few PhD programs. And Dr. Hornsby kind of, really kind of pulled for me and gave me an opportunity. And now I'm in Morgantown. And I think the hard part of that, or one of the harder parts, because the reality of it is like, yeah, you're stressed. Yeah, you're working hard. Yeah, you're tired. It's not really it's not really that bad. And I guess it's because when you do it long enough, you kind of expect and get used to it. I think the hard part can be when you have to project yourself into the future and say, what is this going to do? What doors are going to open? Like, what does this mean for my career? And you kind of mentioned all that happening in a short span of time where, it's nice for me because I can think about it like, oh, I have this like 3 years or 3.5 years in front of me. I don't really know what that's going to turn into or what it's going to mean. But, the fact you can talk about it and kind of enlighten me, it's like, okay, so that there are possibilities and there are things that make it worth it. And sometimes that's really hard for people to commit to because the sure thing, which is what, most jobs are, because I think like the barrier to entry is so low, you can kind of just have whatever background you have and get a job. And if you work long enough, you'll kind of move up the hierarchy and you'll make more money, et cetera, et cetera. But with something like a PhD, you're just committing so much time after you've committed so much time to a master's and undergraduate degree. And then you're pushing off your professional career, or you're saying, I'm like doing what I'm doing. I'm coaching. I'm online coaching weightlifting and powerlifting, and then I have other streams of income with kind of helping some of the guys at Weightlifting AI, and then helping Team Ada, Max and Joanne's kind of business. But it's like you have to be able to have that long-term vision, even if you're just imagining it and making it up. So I really commend you for that, because it's not easy to say, if I do this thing, I know it will be worth it, because you can't really know anything. Probabilistically speaking, sure, it's like a high yield decision, but you don't know that. And I think that's hard. That can be really hard.
Yeah, 100%. I think the one thing that helped, at least early on, and we both share this because you said the same. Is like when we went to grad school, like we went to grad school because it was like something that we like wanted to do, didn't know exactly what it was going to entail, but it was something like we were interested in and just wanted to study like our field to like the furthest degree. And it wasn't necessarily motivated like I'm going to grad school to get this job, to get paid this much, you know what I mean? And then especially for me when I started, because when I was doing my master's degree, I was still actively competing as a weightlifter. And the one thing that did for me, like being an athlete, was it made me like very okay with where I was at the time, because I was okay with like not making a lot of money. I was okay with like not overly like thinking about my like future career goals and stuff like that, because at the time, like my main goal was to get better at weightlifting. Like that was my next few years, was thinking about like, oh, I want to get this much better at weightlifting so I can hit these like snatch clean jerk things. And then I just so happened to be doing that at a place where I was also studying sports science. So it made me a lot more like comfortable, like being where I was and not like constantly thinking about what's next. I was just in it. And I was able to actually focus. Like what's the most important thing is like, if you do go to grad school, you do decide to do a PhD, It's like you've got to be like in it and involved in the process to get like we talked about, to develop your ability to learn and get that out of it. Because like if you just do it purely to like get through it and then like get the paper at the end of the day, like that only helps you so much, and you really only benefit so much out of that. Versus like if you're actually like in it, you take advantage of it. It's this like opportunity that like most people don't have when they're working full-time jobs, where like your full-time job like is to learn and get better at learning. And then like once you're out of that, especially now, just like within my first few years of like working full time, like sometimes I kind of like missed out. I was like, man, I wish I had more time to like learn, more time to like read research and listen to podcasts. Because at the time, that's like all I was doing during my PhD. But like that's the time to do it. But like if you never even have that time and you're just like always in the day to day of like whatever like your current job is, like you miss that, and then you never get the chance to like develop that skill set. And that skill set is just extremely valuable, like in what I do now, or like if you want to be in the sports science field, that the ability to learn, the ability to like critically think, the ability to, do science is a skill, and it's a skill like you have to develop with like dedicated time and effort. And you don't necessarily get that skill by just going to grad school and getting a degree. You know what I mean?
No, and that makes a lot of sense, because I think I really just used weightlifting and powerlifting as a guise for reading research, listening to podcasts, and thinking a lot. And I did that for 11 years, and I now have grad school as another guise for doing the same. And like, but I think at the end of the day, what it does is like, I need to learn a lot of the technology. I need to learn a lot of the processes, and I need to become an expert in like athlete monitoring, and also like have the abilities and be able to showcase what I do know in a way that's understandable by a lot of people. And when you tell people like, oh, I've coached, top 5 in the nation in this sport, or top 10 in the nation, they kind of understand it, but they don't. But if you say, yeah, I have a PhD, like I have a doctoral degree in this thing, it's like, oh, that makes a lot of sense. What I would like to talk about, because you did mention it there toward the end, is kind of what you do in baseball now. How has that learning curve been, and what is your day-to-day like? Kind of when you transition to the Reds, what was that like? Are you doing anything different now with the Giants? What are your roles and responsibilities, and what's the day-to-day like for you?
Sure. So both are somewhat similar roles. So my initial role with the Reds was I was the minor league sports science coordinator. So was responsible for kind of our sports science initiatives across the organization. If you're not familiar with baseball, there's the major league team, which is just a group of about 27 athletes at a time, and then there's an entire minor league organization. And on the whole, each baseball organization has 250 plus players spread across multiple locations. So spread across about in season, like 6 different locations. And you're dealing with athletes of all ages and levels, because we have, all baseball teams actually have academies in the Dominican Republic, where there are young 16, 17-year-old like Latin American players developing that are already signed to the organization. And then you have from that all the way up to your veteran Major League Baseball players that are in their 20s, 30s, and even some like early 40s. So you get this very, very like large span of age ranges and athletes at very different cycles of development. So starting off on the minor league level, for that reason, was really great, because essentially most of what I did and I do now is somewhat related to athlete monitoring. So essentially anything that involves some sort of like scientific, systematic process for assessing, monitoring, and then somehow influencing a player health and performance that's kind of my main responsibility. And that's pretty broad, and it's a lot of different things. But doing that across multiple locations with multiple separate staffs with 200 plus players requires you to be very, very efficient with your work and very like systematic. It's not as simple as like just deciding like you want to do this test and you start collecting it with a few players and then try to do something with it. Because if you're only thinking that like isolated, like it's never going to scale very well. So like whatever you decide to apply, like whether that's like a new technology or like a new process or like looking at a new metric or new measure, like it has to be like really well thought out, has to be very systematic. You have to find ways to communicate why you're doing it, how you're going to do it to, 100 staff of various different, areas, whether that's strength and conditioning, athletic training, field coaching. You want to translate what you're doing over to like front office executives as well, and things like that. So it requires a lot of like principled, systematic thinking in whatever you're going to do, because of just like the scale of it, which is really, really like important, really valuable skill set to develop. So I'm kind of glad that I started at the minor league level and was kind of forced into having to do that, versus potentially if I worked in another sport that maybe you're only working with maybe 10 to 15 players and they're all already like, major league or like elite caliber, versus working with this like large span of anywhere from like these young teenage kids that have a ton of development to these veterans that are already at the top of their game. It's kind of what makes working in baseball extremely fascinating to me. And it also required me to like very quickly kind of develop my skill set.
Yeah, that's really cool. And I have two specific. It's a hyper specific question. When you talk about athlete monitoring, specifically within baseball, and you talk about introducing new technologies, what are very established monitoring tools that are used in baseball that you spend a lot of time managing, processing data from, and then communicating it to other people, to try to create a sense of like the state of readiness of the athlete or the person?
Yeah, I mean, the easiest answer that like all MLB teams and most sports across the, collegiate and then even like high school now, the easiest answer would for sure be force plates. Like everybody has them, everybody's using them in some manner, but it's definitely an area that I spend a lot of time on, and I've dedicated a lot of time on thinking about how we use them. Because like I said, everybody has it. So like having force plates, especially as a professional baseball team, is in no way like a competitive advantage, because everybody has them and a lot of people have had them for like several years. Like the competitive advantage comes in, the process you have in place for using them, the measures that you're looking at, how those measures relate to things that actually matter on the field, how you're communicating why those things matter, how you're communicating the changes and results in those things in individual players, then across an organization, and then what the process is to do based on the results that you're seeing. When you identify a certain trend, like what are there any changes you make? If there are, like what they are. That whole aspect is like where the competitive advantage comes into play. Like that's the hard part, is like figuring out that process and then getting buy-in and scaling it across a gigantic organization. Having the force plates, learning how to run the software on the iPad, knowing where the data goes, like that's the easiest stuff. That stuff you don't need to do a PhD to learn. Like you can figure that out very quickly by just like messing around with it. Everything else on actually applying it is where like, the critical thinking, the principles, the systematic scientific way of doing things, that's where that stuff comes into account. That's where I spend a lot of my time. That's one technology. That's probably the most like standard, easiest answer. There's a lot else. Everybody's doing some sort of like workload monitoring, whether that be with specific GPS sensors or camera-based systems that are installed in the ballparks or stadiums. Everybody's doing something along those lines. Everybody's doing some sort of strength and power training with force plates dynamometry. Most people are doing and have this similar technology. The processes in place for using it are vastly different, and that's kind of what I spend a majority of my time thinking about and constantly trying to improve upon.
Now, you could correct me if I'm wrong, but it feels like what you're saying with this stuff is every team has a weight room, but that doesn't ensure that the weight room's used effectively. And you can use it better or worse, and you can use it in vastly different ways. But the expertise comes in applying the training stress, the barbells, the plates, the dumbbells, all of the equipment, and then doing that effectively. Whereas you can have it and you can apply it, but it can be a mess because it's just like haphazardly tossed together. So in professional sports, everyone kind of has the same stuff, but it's how do we differentiate ourselves by application and then assessment of what we apply, and then how we iterate on that process.
Yeah, exactly. How do you figure out that process, and then how do you scale it across an organization with 250 players, 100 plus staff, multiple different locations? That's the fun part.
Wow. Very cool. Very cool. Yeah, I think this was a great conversation. It was a ton of fun to pick your brain on what you've done professionally, academically, and then kind of hearing a bit more about your background for some context. If people are listening to this and they think, Dylan's a really cool guy, I'd love to chat with him, or I'd love to talk about possible, doing something similar, following in his footsteps in some way. Where can they reach out if they want to contact you about anything that we discussed today?
Sure. So social media wise, both Twitter and Instagram, the handles are Suarez Strength. Twitter is definitely more professional, retweeting papers that I find interesting and things like that. Instagram are going to be a lot of stories and pictures of my dogs. So if you're into that sort of thing, that'd be the place to follow. Twitter is what you'll find the more the science and the academic stuff on there. And then either if people are interested in reaching out, asking any questions or chatting, send DM on either of those, and I'll get back to you, especially if it's the off season. If it's in season, if it's during baseball season, might take me a little bit, but
yeah. And I would implore people to go check that stuff out and to reach out if they have any questions. Because again, what we're trying to do and what I really want to do is provide insight into, what you could potentially do if you go down a similar path that Dylan has gone down, or that I'm going down, or that, Aaron and Dr. Hornsby and all these people have kind of developed and done. So if you want to reach out to me, and if you don't already follow me, you can find me on Instagram at Josh_PhilWL. That's PhilWL. That's Philosophical Weightlifting everywhere else. You can use Phil WL at Weightlifting House, Onyx Straps, Earth-Fed Muscle, Maverick Barbell, and you can save some money and support the podcast. So as another great episode of the podcast has been a recent theme, and we will catch you guys next week, another episode of the podcast.